Good morning, friends. Today, my friends, is Monday, October the 6th, 2025, and the time now is 10:19 a.m. So, friends, I want to talk about Colombia, the South American country of Colombia. And I want to talk specifically about the fact that Colombia has withdrawn, or that Colombia is withdrawing from the IMF flexible credit line program. Now, friends, this is the first time I'm hearing about this, but it is very interesting. When I heard about this news and I read about it, the basic interpretation that I came up with for the IMF flexible credit program or the IMF flexible credit line is that it is an insurance policy, an insurance program for countries. And that seems to be the case because I even visited the IMF website, the credit line program website, and I read about it, the policy. Now, friends, after having read about the policy on the IMF website, the IMF flexible credit line website, and also after having read several articles, I was able to confirm once again that this is an insurance policy for countries. Countries have to make payment, they have to pay fees every year or so to the IMF credit line policy program. Now, friends, by making the annual payments, paying the annual fees, countries will have access to IMF loans at cheaper or low interest. However, friends, in order for countries to have access to the IMF flexible credit line, once again, the countries have to make payment, they have to pay fees. And also, there are several conditions that the countries have to meet. One being that the countries have to have financial or economic policy, which basically enable outside institution to have access to the country's market. Or at least this is one of the way I was able to interpret one of the stipulation. It states that the countries have to be very strong in terms of their financial institutions. They have to have strong financial institutions and maintain strong financial institutions and so on. It is an interesting system. Now, for Colombia, Colombia is saying that since about 2009 or so, it has used the program or it has made payment into the program, the IMF flexible credit line program, and that it only used the program once. So Colombia used the program in 2020 during the economic situation caused by the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, which as of now, I still haven't heard an international declaration of the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps the declaration have been made and I did not hear about it, but I have not heard any government or any country, individual governments of countries or the international system, the World Health Organization, making any declaration that the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic has come to an end. And as of now, COVID-19 is still an issue and people continue to get sick, even though people are not dying as people were dying in 2020, 21, and so on and so on and so on. Friends, I conducted a quick research with a basic question. Who are the owners or who is the owner of the IMF? Yes, the IMF is an international institution, an international financial institution. One thing that I wanted to know is who are the main stakeholders in the IMF and who are the giants of the IMF? Of course, friends, it is certain, and people in the various countries all over the world know that the United States and the European countries are the top dogs in the IMF or in the global financial system. Basically, these guys are the controllers, the owners, the movers, the shakers of international finance and economics and so on. However, in terms of the IMF ownership, who own the IMF, who control the IMF, that is open to debate. And as a result, there has been lots of conspiracy theories out there that many have put forth. However, friends, I do not have anything against conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists. In fact, I welcome them, and this is the reason why. The world has become so messed up, and countries and governments around the world, and particularly the bigger, the powerful, and the most developing countries, they've done so much nonsense to countries, weaker countries in the world, and especially in the global south, to the point where they've opened the door for the rest of the world to ask questions, especially given that the news institutions, the news agencies in the West, in the richer and powerful countries, are not asking questions. They are not holding their governments to the fire. So as a result, conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists persist. My thing is, if the CNN, the BBC, if these institutions, if they are not asking questions, if they are not holding their governments and leaders to the fire, perhaps it only makes sense for people to fill in the gap, for people to ask questions and to make statements. Now, the fearful thing here is anybody could fill the gap, could answer questions, ask questions, and make statements that can be wrong and dangerously wrong and can cause problem for all of us around the world. Now, in terms of the ownership of the IMF, it is said that the IMF is a world organization, world institution, financial institutions owned by countries, there are 191 or so countries all over the world. So every country in the world does have stake within the IMF. So basically, the IMF is supposed to be just like the United Nations, where every country come together to make rules, okay, or to basically push a policy that benefit them in terms of them not being cheated, them being respected, and that the entire world, every country must follow a certain financial rule. However, in the United Nations, we have the UN General Assembly, which just ended recently. Every government country come and gave speeches and so on and so on and so on. I know recently Donald Trump had an issue. He threw a fit because he was going up the UN building and the elevator stopped. He had a problem. Something happened to the teleprompter from which he was supposed to be reading. He had a problem. And Republicans have had problems since then. However, we do have the UN Security Council, which basically is made up of the bigger and powerful countries, basically the White West and the winners, or those who consider themselves to have won World War II. We are talking in this case the United States, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, one of the victors of World War II, even though Russia suffered about 26 to 27 million people in terms of the death, casualties, and so on, depending on the source. And the only non-white country, and a country that is considered to be a member of the Global South, China, is a member of the UN Security Council. For Russia, it is a mixed country. It is a multi-ethnic country. Now, in terms of the UN Security Council basically have the say-so in many things. The rest of the countries, it seems like they are just there to rubber stamp whatever the bigger and powerful countries, most especially in the West, want to propagate. And the rest of the world basically just go along and thinking that they are important. Perhaps it seems that's what the IMF is, where it is supposed to be a global institution. However, the bigger and powerful countries in the West, the conceptual / the White West, do have the ultimate authority. And also, these countries in the West will propagate policies that benefit them and basically hurt the rest of the world. Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and so on. And perhaps this is the case. This is what Colombia is saying. Look, we are paying into a system. We are paying fees for a credit line which we are not using. We are only using it, or we've only used it once in 2020. Perhaps Colombia is right. And this is very interesting. It is like an insurance, though, because the other part here is like insurance, whether we are talking about health insurance, we are talking about dental insurance and so on. You are not using it every day. You're not using it every time. However, when that moment comes, which you will need to use it, that you do have access to it, full access to it, at a cheaper rate. This is what perhaps the IMF flexible credit line is, and this is what is propagated in its website or on its website to be. But my question is, as much as it can be similar to health, dental insurance, and so on, which you are making payment into for the time when you use it. However, countries are making millions, okay, hundreds of millions of payments to the IMF flexible credit line every year, which they are not using. And if you look into this, like for example, Colombia, which began to access the program in 2009 and did not make any withdrawal from the IMF credit line until 2020. So the money that Colombia made, the payment that Colombia made from 2009 to 2019-20, perhaps Colombia could have opened an international sovereign fund for itself, and that money probably would have grown. Colombia could have invested that money in various ways. So perhaps as much as, just like health, dental insurance, which you make the payment into, make yearly payment, monthly payment, and then when you need it, it is cheaper. However, when you look at all of the payments which you would have made, by the time you are eligible, by the time you really need to use that payment, you've paid an arm and a leg. Perhaps this is what Colombia is saying. But also, this happened to deal with April situation between Colombia and the IMF. And the IMF in April this year, 2025, the IMF basically blocked Colombia access to the program. And perhaps what we are seeing could be a retaliation from Colombia saying, look, yes, you're blocking us from accessing your credit line. However, we actually don't need this credit line. We've been making payment into this credit line, which we never used anyway. So by you blocking it, only open the door for us to exit. And also, it also shows us that we are spending money on something that we are not using. However, perhaps just like health insurance, there are many who could say that you probably do not need health insurance if you keep yourself healthy. However, just like Trevor Noah said in one of his program about his mom, that his mom basically canceled her health insurance. However, she never thought about bullet, basically never thought about the possibility of getting shot. Colombia, like most countries, may not need the IMF flexible credit line. However, what if something very serious financially happened to the country? Then in this case, they will need a credit line which they no longer have access to. However, friends, my solution then would mean perhaps Colombia or any country will have to engage or invest in an alternative to basically save money and basically run its country efficiently in order to prepare for any major financial economic situation in the country. Because it seems perhaps countries are making too much payment to the IMF. Countries all over the world and throughout the global south are indebted to the IMF, to the World Bank, and so on. And the bank persists. I owe the IMF or the World Bank. Now, friends, to pay my debt, I am going to get a loan from this institution, that institution, or from that country to pay my World Bank or my IMF debt. In this case, then, I have to pay this institution, or that country, the money that I borrow from them plus interest. In addition to the IMF interest, which I had paid through the money that I borrowed from this country. So it's like every year, every time, the debt of each country basically increase gradually or significantly as well. So this is a very terrible situation for countries around the world. However, if it is true that countries around the world, all over the world, the 190 countries or so, do have access to the IMF, are equal participant in the situation, the institution that is the IMF, Perhaps all of those countries must come together as the UN General Assembly comes together to basically enforce or propagate the notion that the IMF should have a fair and equal opportunity for all countries, rich or poor, weak or strong, powerful or powerless. Now, friends, please tell me what you think, and I really want to know what you think. However, friends, I am going to end here. I want to thank you for being a member of the Echoing Voice community, my friends, but most especially and most importantly, or most important, my friends, I want to thank you a lot for watching the Echoing Voice. Peace, my friends. Peace.